Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 27 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. And we're going to go over the copyright information, which should be on your screen right now. I'm going to find the book first. Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, all rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company and the Random House Company, and the address is there if you're interested. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone Revisited. Printed and bound in the United States of America, and all the Library of Congress information is right there if you are interested in that. Anyways, we have been reading The Riddle of the Crypt, and we'll be finishing that book off, or this story off. And in the last one, they actually found the vampire. There was a vampire. It attacked Irene, and now we're going to see what the aftermath is all about. On the way, Roy announced that he had shot the vampire, and Dr. Felton was highly pleased by the news. When these creatures take on human form, declared the physician, they temporarily lose what might be termed their inhuman immunity. In short, in order to become solid and therefore formidable, they also become vulnerable. I am told that it takes some time for them to change from one state to another. Then where did Lasang go? Demanded Roy, if he didn't dematerialize. He went down into that rock pile. That's where we saw him last. But why would he go into that old Norse ruin? It isn't an old ruin, put in Alan, to answer in answer to Roy's question. I've talked to fishermen on other islands, and they find that some of their ancestors go way back to Lasang's time. They say it was the peasants on the island who tore the castle down and piled it stone by stone over Lasang's grave. Then they went their way on their own accord, and even though the English wanted them to stay. So Lasang was buried there? Dr. Felton exclaimed. You have seen snakes go into some piles, and rats too. We have just fought and trapped a creature that can squirm like any snake or rat. Look here. Dr. Felton took a long stick, thrust it down at various angles into the rocks, and probed about, discovering gaps a foot or more in size. This rock pit, he announced, is honeycombed with passages big enough for that monster to squirm through. You will find him under it. Oh, we will find him under it. No one doubted that now. They set a watch over the rock pile day and night until the fog lifted, and heavy highway construction equipment could be brought by ferry from the mainland. Then they began excavating the great stone pile. As the work proceeded, 2 points became apparent. These actually were stones from Lasang's old citadel on Castle Rock. For mortar was visible on many, and many that were underneath. They also found a definite course of narrow but well-propped openings that twisted down through to form a tunnel route that only a rat or an inhuman vampire would have dared to follow. At last the heap was cleared, and they came across a broad, flat stone inscribed with the name Lavignac that rang a bell with Alan. The fisherman told me about the Lavignacs, he exclaimed. They were the original family who owned the island over several generations. Lasang claimed that they had given him their title, so he was buried with them. Beneath the slab, they found the old Lavignac family crypt with a central burial chamber arched to form a low vault. There, they identified the Lavignac family coffins, all broken apart and scattered about, their remains reduced to skeletons. That must have been the work of the usurper, for in the one unbroken coffin of the lot lay the leathery thing with long, sharp teeth and yellow eyes that could only have been Lasang the vampire. Its bat-like arms folded and claws clenched into fists. From its glassy stare, Dr. Felton decided that the thing had been caught in the midst of one of its transmutations, unable to leave the near human form that it had temporarily taken. He found the wound that Alan's bullet had inflicted, and the physician pronounced the creature dead. Whether the next full of the moon would revive the vampire, Dr. Felton did not want to learn. Late that afternoon, the Morrows were leaving Cliff Island in the Rover, bound on a cruise, which they hoped would help them forget the recent harrowing events. Alan Blount, who was with them, spoke quietly to Roy Morrow, who turned to Irene and said, "Look back, sis, it's Signal Head." There on the head, smoke was rising. Puzzled, Irene exclaimed, "Why, somebody must have started the old beacon, the one that once marked Lasang's arrival," completed Roy, when Irene hesitated. "But in this case, it was marking his departure." "What do you mean by that, Roy?" "Only that Dr. Felton, as health officer, has just decided to burn a lot of rubbish, and with it, that thing we found in the old crypt." The smoke billowed high against the afternoon sky, forming a thick black cloud that spread oddly into a weird bat-like form. A high tuft of smoke was caught by the slight breeze and thinned sufficiently for the bright glare of the golden sun to shine through two momentary openings, giving them the semblance of a huge pair of yellow eyes. Then the illusion faded, as did the dying smoke itself. All that remained of Lasang the vampire from Cliff Island Crypt was a smoldering beacon on Signal Head. Now we are ready for Dead Man's Chest. Give me just a second here. Okay. And now we are going to read Dead Man's Chest. If Lou Barton hadn't dreamed of someday owning a castle on the Hudson, he would never have seen the giant skull that was destined to bring him strange adventure. Lou was working on the tanker Eastern States that made steady prodding trips up the river from New York City to Albany. It was hot on the long open deck of the blister wagon, as the crew appropriately nicknamed the tanker. So they preferred to go below and play cards, all except Lou Barton. He preferred to stay up at the bow and watch the ever-changing panorama from the Palisades on up through the highlands and beyond. What intrigued Lou most was the homes and mansions far up on the heights, some of them resembling European castles transplanted to America. Occasionally Lou would look at some barren knob or towering crag and picture the kind of home that he would like to build there. But the giant skull was no such daydream, though it was partly an illusion dependent on one of the river's moods. It was a hot Indian summer afternoon when the tanker swung around a bend into the blackness of low, glowering clouds, where a sudden breeze chopped the water into whitecaps. Instantly, the mountains were transformed to brownish monsters that loomed twice their normal size. Then suddenly the clouds opened and a great stream of sunlight came through the rift, striking a towering dome and turning it into a vast replica of a human skull. Every detail was etched in light gray and deep black before Lou's riveted gaze. Foaming waves lapped at the skull's jutting jaw. Above that were jagged teeth, a wide grinning row. Two matching blots forming the nose, higher, larger, and much wider apart were the black hollows of the eyes. Above that, a great white bulge of rock became the forehead, which was lopped off squarely at the top, giving it a flattish effect to what should have been a fully rounded crown. Then the river squall hit with all its fury, and Lou was racing back along the tanker's deck. Swept along by sheets of torrential rain, he arrived below drenched as a water rat to the amusement of the card-playing crew. But the image of the giant skull was fixed in Lou's mind. He felt as though his side had pierced a forbidden veil that made him a victim of the Storm King's wrath. Often Lou looked for the giant skull again without result. Going up the Hudson, he seldom saw the same place at the same time and under similar conditions. Changes of season made a great difference. In the summer, the mountains were green and many lost their rugged look. In the winter, they were white. The river was often icebound, and Lou made no trips at all. After Lou gave up his job with Eastern Tankers and switched to Wilton barges, his trips became slower, but that didn't help. As they neared a point which Lou thought might be the one, a squall hit too soon. After they had thrashed through it and the visibility improved, Lou saw rugged cliffs and towering summits, but none of squallish formations or proportions. Later, Lou began taking cabin cruises up and down the Hudson and through the barge canals that run along New York State to Lake Erie. In the winter, he took such craft down to Florida and soon decided that he no longer wanted a castle on the Hudson. He would settle for a cabin cruiser instead, but he needed money for overhead upkeep, taxes, and other items. Lou still remembered the great white skull, however, and kept on looking for it, but without any luck. By now, he knew almost all the landmarks along the Hudson and had inquired into the histories, but nobody had overheard of a huge death's head that leered downstream just when the storm was about to strike. One autumn, Lou Barton heard from Craig Gentry, an affable young man with just enough means to loll around continuously in a good used cabin cruiser called the Willy-Nilly that went north and south with the birds, often with Craig as skipper and Lou as crew. So Lou stopped at his friend's tiny Manhattan apartment and found it overflowing with stacks of papers that came from half a dozen boxes of assorted sizes. Indicating the mess with a wave, Craig said, "We're going treasure hunting, Lou. I'll pay expenses and we'll go 50-50 on whatever we find over that. It may take us a few years. And whose treasure are we going after?" Captain Kidd's. I've gathered data on his entire career. He buried treasure in New England, Long Island, the Bahamas, up the Hudson. Count that out, Craig. I've checked rumors about Kidd's hiding treasure up the Hudson. They're either phony or all worked out, so count me out too. I'll count the Hudson out, but not you. I'll tell you why. Craig proceeded with an exhaustive and scholarly dissertation on the ways and the wiles of the notorious Captain William Kidd. Referred to documented accounts and even a few exhibits as he proceeded. Many pirates like to kill an unsuspecting follower and bury him with their loot, declared Craig, so that his ghost would scare off treasure hunters. But Kidd went them all one better. In a really gruesome way, he would kill a man by bashing him on the head with a bucket, a shovel, or a cutlass, whichever was handiest. He would then bury the body, but bring back the head. The records show that. The records show that? Asked Lou. What was the idea? Because ghosts, far from scaring people away, have been known to guide them to scenes of crimes. Kidd was quoted as saying, "Is the head that knows because it contained the brain that knew." So he kept the skulls of his victims on the theory that the body would attract nothing more than a disturbed, unthinking ghost that could furnish no guidance whatsoever. Kidd really was kidding himself with that crackpot notion. On the contrary, Kidd was far ahead of his time, agreed Craig. I have made a deep study of psychic phenomena, particularly poltergeist disturbances, where strange sounds are heard, objects are thrown about, and unexplained violence may bring injury or death to investigators. I find that they are often due to the presence of some elemental, as blundering earthbound entities are called. And how can that help our treasure hunt? Very effectively. The last headless victim that Kidd buried was with his treasure was Jed Brock, a boatswain's mate from Kidd's ship, the Queldaw merchant. And here, triumphantly, Craig opened a square brass-bound box measuring about a foot in each dimension and brought out an object from within it. Here is the skull of Jed Brock himself. It was brought to Kidd's trial in London, but was not produced as evidence, though it had been preserved ever since. Lou Barton was staring at the skull as through a fog. He took it, held it at arm's length and studied it through half-closed eyes, then asked, "Are you sure this skull belongs to one of Kidd's men?" "Absolutely," returned Craig. "See how the top of the head has been lopped off, squarely squirting it behind the forehead? That was from a stroke of Kidd's cutlass." "I had seen the skull before," affirmed Lou. "We are not ruling out the Hudson Highlands. Instead, we are going there first. I'll tell you why." In detail, Lou described how he had sighted the giant skull, and how, ever since he had tried to identify it with some headland, yet had failed. His account was quite as fanciful as all that Craig had related about Captain Kidd and Jed Brock, the boatswain's mate. But Craig not only accepted it, he enthused over it. "It fits Kidd to the dot," exclaimed Craig. "His maps were false, his codes faked. He even buried some treasure openly, the part that he was willing for his backers to find as their share and think that it was all he had. Instead of treasure maps, Kidd fixed this skull to look exactly like one that he saw staring down the Hudson. You were lucky enough to spot the same giant skull, Lou." "Then you think that that's where Kidd buried the rest of his loot?" "Certainly, right in back of that flat spot that you mentioned on the cliff top. We'll take Jed's skull with us and look for the treasure in your skull." "Don't call it my skull," rejoined Lou grimly, "until we find it." They started on their quest in Craig's cabin cruiser. Lou was able to limit the stretch of river where he had seen the giant skull to a matter of about a dozen miles, but each time they covered it, they were disappointed. The season was right, but none of the hills fitted Lou's description. "I've been over this a dozen times," declared Lou, always wishing I could be my own skipper and try it again. Now I have that chance, but no luck. "We'll keep right on it. We'll keep right on trying," assured Craig. "The harder it is to find, the smarter it shows Kidd was, making it all the more likely that he buried his treasure here. Lots of his logbooks start with comments on the weather, so that fits with the fact that the skull can only be seen under certain conditions. For 3 days they toiled up and down that stretch of river, trying new angles that rounded different points, until suddenly, during one late afternoon Lou pointed over a high ridge that flanked the Hudson and exclaimed, "Storm clouds! Speed up, Craig!" Craig gave it full speed ahead. They cut close past the point and shot straight out into the channel, just as the high clouds opened above a low approaching squall. As Lou had seen it once and only once before, gleaming in the sunlight was the giant skull. Its grinning teeth, hollow nose, and blackened eye sockets formed the face of a 1,000-foot bluff. Its flattened top spoiled the contour of the otherwise rounded dome. Detail for detail, the mammoth death's head was a replica of the human skull that Craig snatched from its box and held at arm's length for comparison. The skull of Jed Brock, the boatswain's mate. Then the squall blotted out the cliff, and the cruiser was tossed like a cork on huge churning waves that seemed to gush up from the riverbed itself. Never even on ocean trips had the willy-nilly met with such a test, but Craig managed to weather it and dock the craft in the shelter of a little cove, where he and Lou danced in glee after the storm had passed. Next, they brought out a topographical map and found the towering cliff that had so briefly disclosed the squallish secret. It was called Round Hill, and though it was skirted by a highway halfway up its overhanging brow. It was called Round Hill, and though it was skirted by a highway halfway up, its overhanging brow was too steep to scale. The best way to reach the top was to go around by a back road called Spruce Lane that led up from White Brook Hollow. Then take an old trail that led past some circular pits called the Granite Bowls, and on up beside the brook on High Ridge directly in back of Round Hill. They had brought along hiking clothes, so they put them on and went ashore, carrying bags and equipment with them. They walked to an old river tavern, midway between a little-used landing with its weather-beaten pier and the railroad tracks, which were higher up on the Hudson's bank. They had dinner at the inn and then stayed overnight to make it appear that they were actual hikers interested only in tramping the local trails. The next morning was foggy, so there was no chance of going out on the river for another look at the giant skull. Anyway, they were eager to get to their new goal, so they started on their hike loaded with their equipment, which included a square box containing the precious skull. It took longer than they thought, for it was mid-afternoon when they finally climbed past the little spring that marked the source of White Brook and came to High Ridge. Over that final hump, they continued to the flat ledge that so resembled the lopped-off skull of poor Jed Brock. The ledge was perfectly smooth and level, forming practically a solid stone foundation. It offered a fine view down the Hudson, but they were too far back now from the brow of the cliff to notice any of the skull formation below. But those, in Craig's opinion, did not matter. He was more interested in studying the ridge behind them. But all they found there was rough ground, small jutting rocks, and scraggly bushes, a dull ending for a treasure hunt. With dark, they pitched a pup tent at the rear of the flat ledge and tried to go to sleep, with the box containing Jed's skull between them. Distant lightning flashes and muffled rolls of thunder were ominous in the offing. "I don't like it here," declared Lou. "We're up where thunderheads gather, right in the Storm King's lap. This might be a rough night before we're through." "Rougher, maybe, than you think," added Craig. Then, cryptically, "When you deal with elementals, you're apt to rouse the elements." "You mean having Jed's skull along might kick up a storm?" "It did down on the river, didn't it? That squall nearly sunk us." "Well, yeah, but it had to be stormy when we saw the giant skull." "That's it, Lou. The two are interlocked. You can't go around it." Lou didn't agree with Craig's notions, which he was beginning to think were quite as crackpot as any ever held by the notorious Captain Kidd, but rather than carry the argument further, Lou compromised by saying, "Anyways, Craig, we'll stick it out tonight so we can hunt treasure tomorrow." They stuck it out almost until dawn, when the Storm King struck with wild rage. The lashing wind swept away the pup tent, and next Lou and Craig were clinging to the rocks, wrapped in their blankets and their ponchos, while lightning flashed and split trees within 100 yards of them, and the thunder rolled above the fury of the gale. They managed to gather partial shelter from bushes where they propped up the tattered pup tent amid a tremendous downpour. Then, when their hopes were at their lowest ebb, and it seemed that no terror could be worse than the tempest raging about them, the climax came in the form of a sight that buoyed their hopes, yet imbued them with new fear. From the ridge behind the fringe of the ledge where they were squatted, they saw a clumsy figure crawling upward as though emerging from the ground itself. Craig mistook it for a bear until Lou gasped, "It's human!" Yet it isn't human. Human in shape, yes, for a vivid lightning flash showed it to be a bulky figure clad in the clothing of an old sailor. It was inhuman, though, because in the brilliance of the lightning's flare, they could see right through the hulking figure to the background of the trees beyond the ridge. Seldom had a ghost revealed itself under such singular circumstances. A ghost in broad daylight would have been startling enough, but in this pitch-black, rain-deluged darkness, the recurring appearance of the thing amid the blinding lightning streaks was beyond all sane belief. With each flicker, it loomed closer from the hump after each blackout. Instead of appearing in luminous form, it was gone. It was gone only to be back when the lightning blazed again. Then the fateful form reared to its full height, its arms raised in a menacing gesture, as though ready to hurl itself upon the staring men, while the terrific thunder reverberated like a peal of doom. In the glare that streaked the entire sky, the two men saw the most startling, horrifying thing of all. The ghost of the mountain ridge had no head. That sight could have caused the most stout-hearted viewers to turn and run regardless of consequences, which in this case would have meant going over the front edge of the flat-topped ledge and down the bulging bluff to certain doom beside the river below. In fact, both Lou and Craig were coming to their feet, ready to flee, when they saw that macabre, terrifying touch of the missing head. To them, it had the opposite effect of what Captain Kidd had anticipated. Sight of a headless ghost stirred their numbed senses, bringing home the realization that this was the moment they had wanted. "It's Jed Brock," shouted Craig. "He's not after us. He's coming for his head." "Then let him have it." Frantically, Lou was tugging the box clasps. The lid came open and Lou gave the box a tilt. "Here it is." Craig caught the skull as it rolled out, held it poised for a breathless moment. As the thunder finished a tremendous roll and the lightning flared again, showing the headless horror ready for its final lunge. Then Craig flung the skull with all his might straight at the weird shape that had now materialized to completely solid form.